Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to a special report on bank safety, and in particular the safety of New Zealand's banks. I've been getting a lot of questions lately, I've been rung at home, emails, the like, from people who are worried about the safety of our banks. They've seen what's happened in overseas markets with the financial crisis. They've heard reports of banks like Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, Halifax Bank of Scotland getting into trouble or even filing for bankruptcy. And they're wondering, well, if those banks fell over, what about our banks? Well, firstly, I want to say our banks are quite different. And our banks are much, much safer than US investment banks and much, much safer than many other investment choices here in New Zealand, apart from perhaps government bonds or trading as Kiwi bonds. Firstly, let's explain what US investment banks actually do. And the key thing here is investment banks. They're really quite different. They lend money in enormous amounts to each other. They deal in very complicated instruments and with very sophisticated customers. They deal in credit default swaps, securitized mortgages. They provide advice on takeovers. They like to think of themselves as masters of the universe, although people don't think they're very masterful right now. I'm sure they don't either. It all was based in the United States on an amazing period in the housing market there, where people found it very easy to get money, to borrow money, to buy houses. Often they didn't have the correct incomes, very little documentation. It was very easy to get money in what was, frankly, a very poorly regulated system. There was also the development of what many called the shadow banking system, where the investment banks were lending to each other using credit default swaps in a way that meant many people thought they were safe, that they had hedged all their risks, when in fact they had concentrated those risks. There was insurance companies who were involved in trading of these things. It really was the Wild West. However, in New Zealand, our bank managers are not the masters of the universe. In fact, they're doing very boring things. They lend money to people who do things with that money, like run small businesses or large businesses, or they live in houses which they've used to buy that, they've used that money for. Our banks lend directly to borrowers, whereas in the United States people would borrow money, the money would be passed on by investment banks to various pension funds and the like, often sliced and diced in many ways. The end lender knew really nothing about the borrower, whereas in New Zealand, the bank knows an awful lot about the borrower. Often they'll see income statements. They'll work out how much money is going out of the account. And so there's a much closer relationship here between the borrower and the lender, and that's a good thing. Also, our banks have great credit ratings. ASB, Westpac, ANZ, BNZ and National all have AA credit ratings. There's not many banks in the world that have those, in fact less than 20. Whereas the banks in the United States had credit ratings, but not quite as good as that. Also, our banks are owned by large Australian parents. And what does that mean? It means essentially they're owned by Australian savers who have over $1 trillion in savings. And that economy is strong. They're also, to be frank, implicitly backed by the Australian government. I cannot imagine the Australian government allowing one of those four banks to fail. The other major bank here in New Zealand is Kiwibank. It has a AA- credit rating. It's owned by New Zealand Post, which provides a guarantee for the money invested that can only be terminated with 3 months' notice. All of our banks are well regulated by the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. It has people crawling all over those banks all the time. Whereas it's clear in the United States, the masters of the universe were masters too of the regulators. They had no idea what was going on. Our housing market too, although it is inflated and many people think it's as overvalued as the United States, prices are high, but our banks, I don't think, have lent willy-nilly. They've lent a lot, but not in the crazy ways we saw in the United States. Also, finally, in New Zealand, you can't walk away from your debt so easily. In the United States, there are many states where they have what they call non-recourse loans. That means people who don't frankly feel like paying back the loan can simply hand the keys back to the bank. That forces the bank to take a huge loss, to sell the house in a mortgagee sale, whereas in New Zealand, you can't do that so easily. The bank will hunt you down and get you. That's the fact of it. So people are much less likely to walk away from their loans here in New Zealand. I'm Bernard Hickey with a special report on bank safety in New Zealand.